fast, but Lynn is our keynote speaker today. And what it is she's a mom. She's a mom who lost a child. And when I say that she's a mom that lost a child, and how can she be our keynote speaker? Because I don't know that I could ever speak if I was in her shoes, but she has professional experience as a counselor, and then she has this experience as a mom, and you put those two things together, and she is a resource that is pretty exceptional to be able to have. And I met with her and talked to her, and I knew that she would speak to our families who have had loss. I knew she could speak to our healthcare providers, and I knew she could speak to all of us PTSD crazy moms who are having all this anticipatory grief that don't even know where we belong. And I reached out to her and we talked a little bit about how she would present today. And I really think that she's going to be really helpful. And I'm so glad she agreed to do this. And I'm gonna let her tell you a little bit more about her history, but I just wanna welcome Lynn and thank you so much for being brave and doing this for us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Marianne. And thank you for the wonderful introduction. And I just want to thank all of you for being here, because it takes courage to show up for something like this. And here you are. So thank you for your courage. Thank you for your time and being here for this time, this talk here, and then this afternoon with all of the wonderful breakouts that will be presented. So just a quick note of who I am and what I do. I'm a caregiver coach that works with parents of chronically ill children, helping you find balance, helping you learn how to not have to be in that hyper alert state 24/7, 365 days a year, how to find some balance for you and be your optimal best in caregiving for your child. So that's a little bit about me. But I wanted, when I was getting ready for this talk, I was telling friends and colleagues about how excited I was to do this. And every single one of them was like, giving me this strange look, like how can you be excited about talking about your Hannah and the fact that you lost her? And I said, oh my gosh, you know what? Any opportunity I have to share about our Hannah is so beyond what I could ever ask for or imagine, because it's part of my healing process to be able to talk about her. And our Hannah, we knew prenatally that Hannah was going to be born with complex heart defects and was going to require several heart surgeries in a short amount of time. And so I remember after finding that out prenatally, that's where my grieving process began. I knew that Hannah would not be leading a normal life like her two older sisters. And so that started that for me. And so when Hannah, after she was born, she had 3 open heart surgeries, one at 4 days old, 7 months, and 2 years. And after her 2-year open heart surgery, that was a really big heart surgery, she had multiple complications where we did almost lose her. And, but it was a miracle that she was able to survive, and we were able to enjoy 13 more years with her. But what I realized is in her recovery and trying to live this normal life as a cardiac kid, everything had to be recalibrated for her, for us as a family, and how we were going to function. And I remember when she was around 11, we were out bathing suit shopping. And at that time, she had become very aware of her zipper scar. And the zipper scar where, for the open heart surgery, that's where they open up the chest and everything. And so she was very self-conscious about that scar. And I was in the dressing room with her and she started crying. And it was at that moment, it really hit me as a mama that she has always been grieving the fact that she was not normal. She could not lead that normal life. She didn't have that normal life like her friends and classmates and her sisters. And that moment kind of solidified for me that I needed to acknowledge her grief, that all these years she continued to grieve whom she couldn't be. And so I remember as she got changed and all of that, I stepped out and I sat on the floor in Kohl's and just cried for a few minutes until she came out. And then I, being the tough mom that I was, I just kind of sniffled my tears back and just kind of got up and went with that. But that was a real poignant moment for me to realize that her grief is significant and that I needed to be able to acknowledge that for her as much as I could. And so being able to do that was just kind of the reality of our lives, right? For our kids, it's a different life. It's a recalibrated life already for us. And so as the years went on, we knew that Hannah was going to require one more big surgery. And we knew it was probably going to be sometime in high school she would need to have that. But what happened is she wound up getting sick after Christmas break her freshman year. And we took her to the ER with what we thought was the flu. And after they ran the blood work and everything, it was discovered that she was in septic shock. And so the fact that she was in septic shock, she was already in really bad shape. And one of the things I was grateful for is that had we waited a few more hours, she would have died at home because she was already so far gone. The blood infection was just overtaking her body. So we entered the ER. We entered her last 3 weeks of life in this hyper alert state already, pretty high crisis mode. And the day after she was admitted, that's when they ran an echocardiogram on her and discovered that what was causing the sepsis was she had endocarditis, which is bacteria on the heart. And there was a significant amount. And as the days were going on, she was deteriorating more and more. Her heart was really, really sick. And it led to cardiac arrest for her. And she had cardiac arrest before, and she's been that drama queen before. But this time they were working on her for over 45 minutes and they could not bring her back. And that's when the medical team decided to put her on ECMO. And as soon as I heard the word ECMO, which is a life support machine, I knew what that meant. And I remember walking into the hallway while they were putting her on ECMO, and I just fell to my knees and begged God, please don't take her yet. Don't take her yet. Because I knew her life couldn't be saved. I knew that the ECMO was just going to buy us time. And so the first few days she was on the ECMO, she wasn't responding like the doctors were hoping she would. Her heart was so sick, nothing was responding very well. And so from literally hour to hour, it was touch and go. And I noticed she was so tired already. And so what I did is I leaned over and I whispered to her and I said, Hannah, it's okay if you want to go. You don't have to fight if you don't want to. And in her drug-induced state, in like Hannah fashion, she shook her head no, as if to tell me, okay, Mom, hold my root beer and watch me fight, because here I go. And that was typical Hannah. There was no challenge she didn't meet. She couldn't meet. She just always went 120% full on. At that same time, we had received get well notes from everyone in her youth group. And there were over 80 notes that I read to her, which were really, really encouraging to her. And at the same time, our church had a 24-hour prayer vigil for her. So you put that combo together, along with the fact that 2 months prior to her hospitalization, she got her black belt in Taekwondo. So friends, this gal, she kicked butt, not only for one day, but she rallied for 11 days, which is so unheard of to do that. But that was so like Hannah, just fight with all her might. And she did such a fabulous job. But the day before she passed, it was decided between the doctors and my husband John and I that we were going to try and get her off of the ventilator, because she had been on it for 20 days, and we were going to try and switch her over to a BiPAP machine the next day. And so throughout the night, the respiratory team were constantly running sprints on her vent to try and prep her and get her ready. And my husband went in the next morning. He was the first one in her room and saw how completely exhausted she was. And at that time, John gave his permission for her to go. He said, Hannah, I see how tired you are, and it is okay to go. And so later on that day, surrounded by John and I and our 2 other daughters, we watched as they simultaneously shut off her pacing wire and her vent at the same time. And she went immediately. She was so done. She was done with the fighting. She was done with everything. She was ready to go. And that was an incredibly heart-wrenching, difficult moment, as you well know. It's incredibly heartbreaking. But as a mama, I was also relieved that she no longer had a fight. She no longer had the alarms setting off, nothing. All those machines were finally silent. And I was relieved. And that's where my grief journey began. And I remember shortly after Hannah died, at the time, I was the camp director for foster kids camp. And it was camp season. It was the launch of our camp season. And so 2 weeks in after Hannah died, I was running informational meetings. I was interviewing potential volunteers and training and all that kind of stuff. And so it was overwhelming. Every single day was overwhelming. And here yet I was trying to function as if Hannah didn't die. And I realized I couldn't do it. And thank God I had a wonderful leadership team that just came alongside and really helped out. But let me tell you, it was so hard and so difficult. What I realized about 2 to 3 months after Hannah passed away is that my PTSD really kicked in. And for me, some of the symptoms that I was aware of is that I was extremely irritable, very impatient with everyone and everything. And I couldn't focus. It was really, really hard for me to focus on anything for more than one moment. And I was having not nightmares, but I was having these really disturbing dreams of Hannah being back in the hospital and me not being able to get to her and not being able to help her and all that kind of stuff. And so I knew that I couldn't suppress the PTSD, but somehow I had to manage to get through camp season. And so after camp was over, I got myself involved in some trauma therapy. And my trauma therapy became my grief counseling. And for me, what it was is that I needed to address the PTSD in order to grieve. Let me say that again, friends. I needed to address the PTSD in order to grieve. And so when I was able to do that, it made room for me to get that healing that I desperately, desperately needed, because those 3 weeks were so incredibly impactful for me because I lived in that hyper-vigilant, hyper-alert state, crisis mode. I remember it took me a month after Hannah's memorial, before things started settling down in my heart, my mind, my body, my soul. And so I was so revved up, I needed that trauma therapy to help me get unrevved, so to speak. And so being able to do that in my first year of grief was really, really important. And I continued the trauma therapy for about 14 months because there was so much there that I had to work through. But the PTSD got triggered a few times, and that 8 months after Hannah passed away, our nephew was killed in a motorcycle accident. And that was incredibly traumatic for our extended family once again. And so that triggered my PTSD. And then just a few weeks shy of Hannah's first anniversary of her death, I wound up in the same hospital that she was at with kidney complications. And so I was hospitalized twice and all of that. So that really kicked in my PTSD as well. So I realized that I needed a significant trauma therapy in order to make the room for the grief that I needed to do and to heal from. So in my second year of grief, I remember a friend telling me in my first year that, well, you know, Lynn, the second year is actually going to be harder than the first. And I thought, are you kidding me? How is that possible? Because the first year is like a blur. It's a total blur. And you're just trying to survive, trying to keep your head above water. And so the second year, it was more difficult. It's hard enough losing our children. But then the second year, why it was more difficult for me is that I realized I was needing to learn how to live without her. That our family dynamic was shifted now. What was that going to look like? And so the reality of that loss, the reality of her not being around was very, very difficult. And one of the things that was even more difficult for me is that when you have a chronically ill child, your main role is being an advocate. And so I was going through a bit of an identity loss. I lost my identity because I was no longer Hannah's advocate. I didn't have to advocate medical, academic, social, anything. All of that was gone. And so I lost who I was for a while. And with that, I found myself kind of drifting into this pit where I didn't know what was going to happen and who I was and where was I going to go with this. And what was happening was that my grief was starting to identify who I was, which was not a good thing for me to do. And I realized I needed to try and get out of that pit a little bit. So in the second year, my husband and I, we got involved in a program, in a grief program called Grief Share. And it was phenomenal. It was we had done a few other grief programs before, but this one really hit the spot for us, especially for my husband, because it has videos on a different topic related to grief every week. And by golly, those videos were so spot on with what I was thinking, with how I was feeling. And you got a workbook along with that so you could kind of process through the week what you were learning through those videos and the small group sessions and all that kind of stuff. And it was really great. So that really helped me kind of get some perspective and start coming out of that pit that I found myself in year 2. But then by years 3 and 4, what was hopeful was that I felt like I was starting to emerge. I was starting to come out of that fog, that pit, so to speak, where I started to have some hope and I started to learn how to take those steps forward. Because we don't move on, friends, we don't. You can't move on from loss. It's about how to learn to move forward. And so at that time, I had launched a grief blog that quickly morphed into what is now my business of midlife. It's called Midlife Moxie. And it's kind of funny, but I named it, I gave it a nod to Hannah, because Moxie stands for brave, strong, fearless, courageous. And that was Hannah. That was the epitome of Hannah. She was incredibly joyful all the time. And she was fearless with everything, with all that she went through. She was super strong, super brave. She taught me so much. And so I wanted to give a nod to her as a way to honor her and carry on her legacy of being that strong, that persevering person that she taught me to be. And so being able to do that, that's where things kind of emerged into the way things are now. And I've just entered into this 5th year of grief. And before hitting this 5th year, the really cool thing is that everything that I was doing in my business kind of led me to the point of saying, you know what, it's time for the grief to come full circle. And what I mean by that is, now that I work with parents of chronically ill children, which I never thought I would do, but I am, because I've been able to do some of the healing that's necessary in order to be able to provide some perspective for others. And so by doing that, I'm able to carry on the hope that I can move forward, and proving to myself and being able to show others that you can emerge from the rubble. You feel like, how am I ever going to function? And there's this beautiful connection, this beautiful intersection of life and grief. And in the beginning, it's hard to imagine that there can be this beautiful intersection of them both. But it is possible, because it's not like grief can be this cute little box of keeping it compartmentalized and we can keep it over in the corner while we live our lives over here. That's not possible. But through the healing and through the time, it allows the opportunity to bring both of these together, where grief is a part of our lives, because it'll always be with us. We will always be grieving. There's no time limit on it. And so for me, being in the spot that I am now and having opportunities like this to be able to share is bringing that grief full circle. And I'm ever so grateful for that opportunity to bring that forward. And so as we kind of wrap up here, one of the things, I just wanted to share a few ideas that maybe can be helpful for you as you move forward with your grief journey, or what can that even look like? And so the first idea I wanted to kind of toss out there for you is to give yourself permission. Give yourself permission to grieve. Like I said, you can't put it over in a corner and take out the box when you think you're ready, because you know what? You're never going to feel like you're ready. You never will. But one of the things in working with people, what I've noticed is that there's a lot of fear around grief, thinking that some way, ooh, if I start to grieve, I'm going to just lose it and I'm not going to be able to function. Like you're going to fall apart and you're never going to come back together again. And I just want to say that that is not true. It's not true. It might feel like it in the moment, but it's not true. And I've watched people in their grief where they've tried to suppress it and push it down. And I always liken it to the analogy of, if you try to press a balloon underwater, what's going to happen? It's going to keep popping up. And what I've noticed with others that I've known who are grieving loss of children and other loved ones is that if you try to suppress it, it will continue to pop up, and then it's going to have a negative impact on your entire life, for your professional career, for your personal life, for mental, physical, spiritual. It can really take a really significant toll on your whole being. And so giving yourself permission to grieve is a really, really first important step. And so along with that comes the idea too. So once you give yourself permission to grieve, then you can move into giving yourself the grace and space you need. Give yourself the grace and space you need. And what do I mean by that? What does that even look like? Well, number one, can I say it's getting rid of the expectations that you have placed on yourself. Get rid of those expectations. And what some of those expectations can be is one of them could be a time limit where, all right, 6 months are gone, I should be good. And can I just say, please, please don't should on yourself. Relax, I said should and not the other word. Don't should on yourself. Because if you do, it's just going to make it worse. But if you remove that expectation that there's a time limit to your grief, you'll be amazed at how relieved you will feel knowing that you don't have to be done with your grief in a certain time. Now, society kind of expects us to be done within a few months, like somehow the death of our child is a mere blip on the radar screen. And that's anything but the truth. So being able to remove those expectations is really, really important. And then taking the time, another thing that you can do is take time to be alone. Give yourself the space you need. There were times where every year, every fall, I was going away for a retreat for several days up to a week because I needed to just be silent. I needed to drown out all the distractions and all the noise and get rid of all the busyness that I was using to try and distract and take away from the grief. I needed to just kind of recalibrate and refocus for a time. And so take that time alone. If it's a day, if it's an hour, whatever that looks like for you, take that time and give yourself that grace and space to do that. But then here's the kicker. Here's another thing to keep in mind to give yourself grace and space. Be willing to say no to others. And let me just say, friends, that no is not a swear word. So it's okay to say no to friends, to family. Because sometimes the best thing you can do is set a boundary, especially for me, when it comes to holidays. Christmas is incredibly difficult for me. And so for me to say no and to really limit my time with extended family and everything, they know that that's my boundary and there's nothing that's going to change that because there's no way that you can go back to being normal or being like things were. That's not possible. And so giving your ability to say the word no is really something that you can do to help give yourself that grace and space to move forward. And I hope you will be able to do that. Learn how to move forward instead of moving on, because that's not possible. But I want to leave you with a little analogy of wound care and the whole concept of wound care. And you know that for a wound is usually like deep in your skin and lots of layers and all of that. And if you try and just put a Band-Aid over it, what happens? It's not going to heal because if you take the Band-Aid off, it still has that gaping hole. And if you don't attend to it, it can get infected and can cause all sorts of problems, right? And so you don't want that. But what happens with wound care is that you have to pack the wound so that it can heal from the inside out. And it's like that with grief. We have to be willing to heal from the inside out. And if you try and put a Band-Aid over it, try and use busyness, distractions, whatever you want, however you want to name it, whatever you do there, that is going to not help you heal. So think of those ways, come up with those ways that's going to work for you to heal from the inside out. And everyone's journey is different. How I grieve is very different from how my husband grieves, how my girls grieve. And I've needed to learn to accept where people are differently on their paths, on their grief paths. And same for you. Find something that will help you give yourself permission and then give yourself the grace and space to do so. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm so grateful to have you here for today. And my hope is that this afternoon and the wonderful breakout sessions that are here for you will be more additional great information for you to help you along your journey. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I have some questions if you're willing.
Oh, sure. Okay. I know that'll take us over, but that's fine.
We're okay, right, Jess?
Yep.
Okay, good. They're in the control room underneath me because I have not been vaccinated. So,
okay.
Can you provide maybe to us so we can pass it on the name of the grief program that you participated in?
Yes, it is called griefshare.org.
Okay.
Griefshare.org. And there you'll be able to plug in your zip code, and it'll list all of the different groups that are in your area.
Okay. And then we have folks asking for your website address.
Oh, yes. It is midlife-moxie.com. Make sure you put in the dash, midlife-moxie.com.
And just to let you all know that I'm getting questions, we will provide, we can't share the grief share information because it's not something we have vetted yet, but her website we absolutely can share with you, and we will be doing that.
All right.
Can you provide notes from your lecture? Would that be something you'd be able to do for people are asking for notes?
Sure. Yes, I can do that.
I took some. I think you and I could get together on that.
Okay.
Does your family talk openly about grief?
Our daughters do not. Our daughters they're adult children. One is married, one is graduated from college on her own. They chose never to address their grief. And can I just say that they are kind of an example of what not to do and what happens when you don't address the grief, and the level of anxiety, depression, and challenges that they have as a result of not addressing their grief. But my husband and I, we do talk about and cry together. Still, after 5 years, we can still cry together.
Yeah. There's a question from a mom who has lost a child who's here with us today, but she asked me to keep her name silent. Do you feel like learning to live again, which you mentioned, is okay?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. And can I just say, for all of us, you might feel a little guilty in thinking like, oh my gosh, I'm kind of starting to emerge and move forward. That's absolutely a wonderful way that we can honor our children, and thinking of those ways that you can honor them in a way that celebrates them, but acknowledges you, because you are an individual outside of your children. And I know that's hard because it's heart-wrenching, but it's absolutely okay and a great way to celebrate your child.
Okay, one more question. I feel like this one's super important. I'm trying to learn to move forward. I feel like there's a microscope on our family every time we experience joy. There was something like intelligible under that, but I think that gets to the heart of the question.
So when others are scrutinizing your emotions, okay, so I laugh at this because what I learned after year 2 of my grief process is that I have to shut out everyone else. Unless that person or those people have experienced the excruciating pain I have, they have no business in making a judgment. And people will, they will. And that was part of the reason I launched the grief blog, which you can find a lot of grief posts on my website, where I address that, like to give to others, like what not to say, what not to do with others who are grieving. And so it's learning to not drown out, but just kind of let go of others' expectations and be where you are and give yourself permission to be okay where you are. And joy is absolutely wonderful.
Okay, so one last one I just got. How hard was it to stay married after the loss of your child?
I do realize that the divorce rates for couples who have a chronically ill child, those are very, very high. For John and I think because we had all those years, and again, when she was 2, when we almost lost her, we learned how to come together in a time of crisis. And our faith plays a huge part in that as well. It's not a, the be all end all, but it played a factor in helping us process together. So what I'm finding is now, as more time goes on, that he and I are pretty different in how we handle the grief, but we still find something in common that can bring us together. So it is hard. And if it is extremely hard for you and your partner, my suggestion would be to maybe seek out a counselor, a marriage counselor who specializes in grief work, because there's that whole component that unless they understand that grief aspect, they're not going to know how to help repair a marriage.
Lynn, thanks again for joining us today. I really appreciate you. So
Thank you.